The latest from the UN General Assembly as world leaders give their speeches on Tuesday. 12 civilians and a soldier killed in a rebel attack in eastern DRC. And hopes for success as South Africa restarts phase 3 of its COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm joined by Uche Okoronkwo with your business headlines.
Thank you, Lindy. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. Conflicting reports concerning TikTok's American operations make a likely deal precarious. And Ghana's gold royalty fund to seek listing at the London Stock Exchange. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, it is back to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Uche. Well, at this hour, our reporters are standing by with the latest from various parts of the globe. We'll be live with CGTN's Girum Chala in Addis Ababa, where the Ethiopian general election calendar is now taking shape after Parliament's approval. And in New York, we have John Terrett keeping an eye on the United Nations General Assembly proceedings. And that's where this edition of Africa Live begins. Well, John, of course, unlike previous years, world leaders are giving virtual addresses to the UN General Assembly, but their messages are no less powerful. We do know that Chinese President Xi Jinping has told the Assembly that developing countries need more help in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. John, what more can you tell us?
Well, you know, Linda, you're absolutely right. This is essentially a virtual UN General Assembly. The General Assembly Hall is operating. There's a small number of people in there, massively social distance. Of course, we're getting the thoughts of the leaders as they come in on tape from around the world. But what is not happening this year is that the business of the General Assembly is not happening. Those ambassadors and those diplomats and those leaders and those deputy leaders are not meeting in the corridors or for coffee or for a glass of wine. So that is not happening this year. The star of the show, though, on this first day of the speeches section of Leaders Week was President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. Now, President Trump spoke first. He is the leader of the host nation. He spoke second on the agenda. It was a very short speech, only about less than 10 minutes long, something like 7, I would guess at. And in his sights, very firmly, China and the World Health Organization. He was heavily critical of both. It took him barely 2 sentences to get to the words China virus, which is one of his favorite phrases when he attacks China. And the speech was primarily about COVID-19, about China trade policy and emissions. He talked about rampant pollution coming out of China. Now, President Trump is always controversial. Today was no different. He made unsubstantiated allegations about China locking down its people at the height of the COVID-19 crisis there, particularly in Wuhan and Beijing. But then he said that they allowed Chinese people to travel around the world, infecting the world. And he said the UN must hold China to account for its actions. Well, one of the problems of having Leaders Week with speeches that are on tape is that those leaders can then not respond to what has been said either immediately before them or just before them. So it fell to Zhang Jun, who is China's ambassador to the United Nations, to push back a little bit at President Trump. He said that in the introduction to his boss, he thought there was no place for bullying at the General Assembly or baseless allegations. Now, when President Xi spoke, it was rare that we see him at the General Assembly. Of course, he was speaking from Beijing. He talked about China making sure that there is a vaccine available globally as soon as possible. He said this will not be the last pandemic, and so the world should join hands together to try and fight them in the future. He talked about COVID-19 prompting a green revolution. He was very explicit about that and said China is absolutely ready to step up to the plate. He talked about the need for a new type of international relations. He talked about more cash for various UN agencies, and he said that China has no intention to fight a Cold War or even a hot one, he said. And now finally, other highlights of the speeches this morning. President Erdogan of Turkey was here talking about a regional conference to try and settle ongoing East Mediterranean issues. President Putin has spoken within the last hour, mainly about COVID-19 and Russian efforts to come up with a vaccine. And Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is speaking here today, talking about a stimulus package for African countries, swift action against racism, and greater accountability and representation for African nations on the Security Council. Ramaphosa saying it's only through reform of the Council that that we can solve conflicts.
And indeed, John, when it comes to representation for Africa at the UN, the call is for 2 permanent seats on the UN Security Council. How is this demand being received in New York? And what other Security Council reforms are likely to be debated there?
Well, you know, this is a long-standing issue. It's been around for a very, very long time, and you're absolutely right. One of the key demands from Africa is that it should have at least 2 seats on a reformed Security Council. Now, what's happening generally is that large countries like India and Brazil are pushing very hard for UN Security Council reform, and that, as part of that, includes aligning with various African nations. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa, I've already told you, mentioned it directly in his speech, or is mentioning it directly as part of his speech here at the UNGA, and he also said that the Security Council needs more consensus on issues, and he was referring really to the ability to get some African voice on a permanent basis in there. And President Erdogan of Turkey also mentioned the issue. He said there are more than 5 countries in the world, referring to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Now here, I'm afraid, Lindy, I have bad news for Africa, because I'm afraid Security Council reform is no longer top of the agenda here, if it ever was. Turkey, Brazil, India, these countries, BRICS nations, are likely to go ahead and push for more reform of the Security Council. They will maintain pressure. But I'm afraid the issues that are not dominating the UN, certainly this year, are very different from the Security Council and away from it. They are climate change, they are ceasefire issues, and of course the whole theme of this year's General Assembly is COVID-19 and how best to fight the pandemic. Lindy?
Indeed, many issues, of course, dominating this year's agenda. Thanks very much for giving us a thorough review of today's events. That's John Terrett there in New York. Now let's turn to Ethiopia, where the country's electoral board is expected to announce the schedule for the nation's general elections. That's after Parliament agreed to hold the postponed polls. Now, earlier on Tuesday, legislators also approved the appointment of several key ministers and judicial officers. The polls have been delayed twice. The first time was due to threats of violence and instability, and the second was due to the coronavirus pandemic. CGTN's Girum Chala joins us live now from Addis Ababa with more on this. Girum, following Parliament's decision to hold the delayed elections, what's likely to happen next, and what do we know so far about the election timetable?
Thank you very much, Lindy. This election has been controversial one way or another, as the government decided to postpone it due to the outbreak and spread of the COVID-19 pandemic itself. And for a long time, the opposition has been naming it an unfair decision by the government to postpone elections. And as you remember, recently in northern Ethiopia, the Tigray regional state has also held elections on its own because of this kind of confusion and dissatisfaction by the decision of the central government. But the central government has been strong, and the Ministry of Health was also backing this idea. And at the end of the day, the electoral board has also endorsed it, saying that elections could not be held because of the spread of the virus, and we cannot risk the population here. But now that time has come that the Ministry of Health recommended that, well, risks could be lowered at this time around, and the country can manage the spread of the virus itself, and elections can be held. Endorsing that recommendation, the country's parliament said that Ethiopia can go ahead and hold its elections. And this time around is going to be the 6th general elections, which is going to decide the next administration. And this is one of the biggest elections that the country has, apart from those that are being held every now and then to perhaps, complete the missing parts of parliament members and other administrations. So the decision by the parliament is remarkable. This has been expected for a long time, and it also resolves some of the confusions from the opposition or even the population as the country, because you know that the current administration's legal term is going to be concluded in about 2 weeks' time, and many were wondering what's going to happen next. But this is going to resolve lots of issues, And as you've said earlier, the country's electoral board is going to come out with the election schedule itself, but Ethiopia is going to hold its 6 general elections sooner than later.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Girum Chala, joining us there live from Addis Ababa. Now, at least 12 civilians have been killed in an attack by rebels in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. A Congolese soldier was also killed in the overnight attack that was carried out near the border with neighboring Uganda. CGTN's Chris Ochamuringa has more from Kinshasa.
The attack happened in the town of Mbao in the DRC's North Kivu province. Local leaders say 3 homes were torched in the raid that lasted 2.5 hours. Authorities have blamed it on the Allied Democratic Forces rebel group. The group is originally from Uganda. Its fighters have been killing civilians in eastern DRC since the 1990s. According to an international organization that monitors conflict in eastern DRC, the rebels have killed more than 500 people since last year. Eastern DRC has been racked by conflict for over 2 decades. A multitude of armed groups have been fighting over land, ethnic rivalries, and the control of mineral resources. The DRC army launched an offensive against them last year, but the killings have since increased. Chris Ochamuringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
The Uganda Prisons Service says samples taken from inmates that escaped from a prison have tested positive for COVID-19. A group of 219 inmates escaped from Singila Prison in the northeastern town of Moroto on September 16th. Isabel Nakiria reports.
The Uganda prison spokesperson says a high number of inmates that broke out of jail a week ago are COVID-19 patients. Out of the 161 samples which had been taken from the prisoners, 60 tested positive. This has caused a health scare as the hunt for the escapees continues.
The prisoners have been divided into groups. Some staff have been under quarantine. In fact, our reinforcement team was in transit by the time this happened. So even the issue of COVID-19 trauma could have also ignited this kind of thing to happen in our facility.
Both the Uganda Army and the police forces are helping in the rescue operation. 2 more prisoners who were part of the group that escaped were shot dead, bringing the total number of those killed to 5. 9 have so far been captured. 1 soldier was killed in an exchange of fire. The joint forces say the search for more escapees and stolen guns is still ongoing, but the difficult terrain of Mount Moroto, where the prisoners are believed to be hiding, is a challenge.
It's raining in Karamoja, highly mountainous. Sometimes you cannot engage the aircraft. Sometimes the hills are so steep, so climbing becomes slower. Yes, but all the same, regardless of what is on ground on the train, we shall be able to pursue them. We have always done so, we've always done so, and we shall still do it.
Prison authorities say most of the inmates in the Singila prison were jailed for offenses like cattle raids. Cattle rustling is a long-time activity in the northeast part of Uganda, and raids are carried out with guns. The government has in the recent past carried out disarmament exercises, but some guns still remain in the community. The government says it will not stop carrying out the operation until all the prisoners are captured. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
About 200 teams of medical researchers around the world are working on a vaccine for COVID-19. In Africa, the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa has been carrying out its own studies and is now in phase 3 of clinical trials. CGTN's Zulisa Njamela has more.
South Africa is spearheading the first trial in Africa to test the vaccine against the coronavirus. The trial aims to find a vaccine that will prevent the virus that causes COVID-19. This hospital, the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, is one of the trial sites. According to Wits University, some 2,000 people between the ages of 18 and 65 have already been enrolled in what is widely considered to be one of the earliest and most advanced trials for a vaccine to tackle the coronavirus pandemic. The trial is being led by Professor Shabir Mahdi, a global leader in vaccine development.
So currently there's 2 COVID-19 vaccine studies underway in South Africa. The one is the study the vaccine that was developed at the University of Oxford, and the second is a vaccine that was developed by Novavax, which is a biotech company in the United States. In the University of Oxford vaccine candidate, we almost completing enrollment into that study. The target size was about 2,000 participants.
But challenges persist. After a participant fell ill earlier this month, the COVID-19 vaccine was voluntarily put on hold. Even though the medical event took place in the United Kingdom, the trial was stopped worldwide. But the vaccine trials have recently recommenced locally. Many are now keen to know when the vaccine will likely be available.
And I think based on what's happening currently in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, France, where they're seeing a resurgence of the virus, it's very likely that in those countries they would be able to determine whether the vaccine protects against COVID-19 or not during the course of this year, in the next few months. So that might very well happen in those countries, which is great news.
The World Health Organization says nearly 180 vaccine candidates are being tested around the world, but none has yet completed clinical trials. The organization has said it does not expect the vaccine to meet its efficacy and safety guidelines in order to be approved this year because of the time it takes to test them safely.
So in terms of when a vaccine is likely to be licensed, it's obviously a global initiative. And right now there's about 9 different vaccines which are in what we call phase 3 studies, which is sort of your pivotal studies upon which you can decide or determine the safety of the vaccine, as well as whether the vaccine protects against COVID-19.
Wits University is collaborating with Oxford University on the vaccine trials, with funding from the South African Medical Research Council and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Yuli Sanjamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program. Coming up, we meet the Congolese activist who's won the UNHCR award for helping refugees. World Rhino Day, we look at the fate of the African black rhino. Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories. Let's have a look. We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Aden, Shirishi, Tunis, Cairo,
Sharia,
Juba, Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Africa's black rhino population has been rising in recent years, but the species remains endangered as poaching and demand for their horns persist. Between 2012 and 2018, the black rhino population grew at an annual rate of 2.5%, an increase of nearly 800 rhinos in the wild. Conservationists are warning that rhinos remain under threat and there will be a decrease in the growth rate of the population over the next 5 years. This according to various population models. Well, let's get some perspective on this. We're now joined by Kenneth Onzere, a rhino monitoring officer at the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us, Kenneth. Now, the general view is that the African black rhino numbers are rising gradually, this despite poaching. Perhaps tell us more about the Kenyan case.
Looking at the Kenyan case, back in mid-90s, the population was below 400, and the government took various measures, including strengthening security systems and looking at the biological management aspect, and these have seen the numbers increase to the current about 800 black rhinos. At the end of 2019, Kenya had 794 black rhinos. So these numbers have doubled, and this year 45 birds have been recorded so far. So the numbers have been doing well, they've been increasing.
And that is certainly very impressive to see such a good rise in those numbers. But what has puzzled some observers is that despite these robust anti-poaching mechanisms and policies in countries like Kenya, we are still seeing poachers getting away with their illicit trade, indeed in Kenya and other countries. What is the gap here?
Majorly the gap is the demand for rhino horn. When the demand is still there, poachers will find each and every reason or do everything in order to get this zone. And that is where the problem is. If you can address the issue of the rhino horn trade and actually reduce the demand in the market, then we can actually tackle this. But anti-poaching efforts have contributed majorly to the increase in population. Looking back between 2010 and 2014, when poaching escalated, for example, in 2013, 59 cases were recorded in Kenya for poaching. Now, as of last year in 2019, only 4 cases were reported. And this year, no case has been reported, or there is no known case at the moment. So these efforts have actually yielded good results.
And Kenneth, of course, this year's World Rhino Day comes right in the middle of a global pandemic when tourist revenues are extremely low. How has this impacted conservation efforts in Kenya?
COVID-19 has had significant impacts on conservation of wildlife. One of the impacts is a disruption in funding as a result of from tourism and donors. So many organizations have been hit by this financial crisis, and they have taken measures to address this. One of them is re-strategize their priorities and focus on key areas or departments in their organizations. For example, in the securities and wildlife sections, these are the areas that have been strengthened. And then the other areas, operation costs have been reduced, the number of staff has been reduced. So it has had huge impacts. So we are hoping that in the near future, this pandemic is going to end and tourism is going to rise. Looking at the Kenyan cases, the government is trying to relax some of the measures that it had put in place, and we've seen tourists coming. So we hope this trend is going to be reversed, and funding will be available to these conservation organizations.
Indeed, the hope is that slowly but surely things return to normal. Thank you so much, Kenneth Onzere, joining us there from the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a Congolese activist has won the UNHCR Nansen Refugee Award. The prestigious annual prize honors those who've gone to extraordinary lengths to support forcibly displaced or stateless people. Sabuni Francoise Chikunda has endured extreme adversity and trauma to emerge as a champion for other refugee women.
She endured violence, torture and rape at the hands of armed militiamen who kidnapped her and held her as a slave for years. She survived a brutal attack in which her husband and children were killed. The 49-year-old's traumatic past has led her to seek out other survivors of violence.
My name is Sabuni Francoise Chikunda. I'm a refugee myself, but I also help my fellow refugee women to improve their life.
It's a journey she began only 3 years ago after arriving at Uganda's Nakivale refugee settlement. She was fleeing violence from her home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
I went through a lot of things. Through a lot of things. I lost my home. I lost my family, my job, everything.
With support from the UN Refugee Agency and other partners, she was given a space in 2018 to set up the Kabazana Women's Center. More than 1,000 women have benefited from the training in various income-generating activities.
I feel so nice teaching women and girls in these situations, because when we are busy, we are not idle. It makes our mind to focus on the future.
Chikunda is now a community leader, a volunteer teacher, and a counselor. Her work has attracted international recognition. She is the regional winner for Africa for the UNHCR Nansen Refugee Award. The annual prize will be presented to her by the UNHCR in a virtual ceremony on the 5th of October. Chom Hono, CGTN.
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Kenya's unemployment rate soared as about 1.7 million people lost their jobs between April and June. Among the hardest hit were single-parent families raising children through this period. Recently, a local non-governmental organization took up the challenge to help these families. The organization has been providing free meals to children with the support of the Chinese embassy in the country.
In Ruiru, a town that's 40 minutes drive from Kenya's capital, Nairobi, Caroline Ndungu is busy preparing food. She is the founder of Jewel Souls Hope Foundation, a humanitarian organization. The organization recently launched a feeding program that helps single mothers struggling to provide for their children.
We didn't have money to buy those things now. But when the Chinese embassy came through, they told us, what we are going to do, we'll give you $5,000. Then you use that money for the next 2.5 months to do the projects.
Caroline Ndungu, as well as the other members of the foundation, are single mothers. From her own experience, she understands how hard life can be, especially during the pandemic.
I am a single mother of 3 children, boys. Sometimes we had nothing to give children. We're happy because of this program, and we pray that you shall continue to give us food for our children.
Eunice Wangoi, a Standard 7 pupil, is among the 120 children Caroline's organization is feeding. With learning institutions closed due to COVID-19, many children are no longer able to access free school lunches.
I want to tell all the donors that donate to us this food. I want to thank them, and I want to tell them to bring us more food.
Right now, I think things are getting tougher. So every day I'm having new faces. And it's sad for a child to come and tell them, no, go back home, we don't have food for you.
Besides the meals they serve on weekdays, the foundation gives each child 2 kilograms of maize flour so that they have something to eat on weekends. Caroline believes that with more donors like the Chinese embassy, she can continue to help such families. Joy Kiruki Juma, CGTN.
And let's now go to Uche for your latest business news.
Thanks, Lindy. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. Conflicting reports concerning TikTok's American operations make a likely deal precarious. And Ghana's gold royalty fund to seek listing at the London Stock Exchange.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues for taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
let's start off with the future of TikTok in the US. Now, conflicting reports are making an agreement concerning the app's American operations seem precarious. The multi-billion-dollar deal was supposed to calm Washington's security concerns, but TikTok's owner, ByteDance, potential partner Oracle, and of course President Donald Trump are now disputing the details. Here's Jim Spellman reporting.
The deal to spin off TikTok into a new US-based company appears to be very much in flux. The deal calls for Oracle, along with Walmart, to become the, quote, trusted tech partner of TikTok, with a new company known as TikTok Global to be formed and based in the United States. An initial proposal called for TikTok's parent company ByteDance to retain control of the new entity, with Oracle and Walmart taking minority stakes and Oracle hosting US data. A revised deal emerged that saw Oracle and other U.S. interests controlling a majority stake of TikTok Global. U.S. President gave tentative approval to that version of the deal. But in a statement Monday, ByteDance seemed to indicate it will retain 80% control of TikTok Global, at least until the new company can be taken public. Trump is threatening to reject such a deal, telling Fox News, quote, if we find that they, Oracle, don't have total control, then we're not going to approve the deal. Adding to the confusion, Oracle seems to contradict ByteDance, saying the Chinese tech giant, quote, will have no ownership in TikTok Global. Any deal needs approval from Washington and Beijing. TikTok was slated to be removed from Apple and Google's app stores at the end of the day Sunday, but with talks seeming to make progress, that deadline for TikTok was extended a week, buying U.S. users at least a short reprieve. Meantime, WeChat has been given a reprieve of its own, a court in the U.S. halting, for now, the Trump administration's plan to ban downloads of the Chinese app in the United States. The Trump administration is fighting the court's order. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Bethesda, Maryland.
And moving on now, a cache of over 2,000 leaked documents shows that global banks have transferred more than $2 trillion in allegedly illegal funds over nearly 2 decades. Now, in defense, banks say they have compiled, or rather complied with all regulations, but the shadow of misconduct remains, and some banking shares have fallen to 25-year lows following that report. Our Naweed Jabrakil has more from London.
Some of the biggest names in banking facing another scandal. A series of leaked reports allege global banks were involved in moving dirty money around the world, in some cases for criminals. The so-called FinCEN files include more than 2,500 documents, most of which were sent to US authorities by banks to highlight potentially shady activity. They center on suspicious activity reports, or SARs, which banks have to file to notify law enforcement of suspicious transactions. That could include things like money laundering, fraud and corruption, terror financing, or violating sanctions. They aren't proof of any crime or wrongdoing, but are supposed to act as a red flag. In total, the documents, which were obtained by BuzzFeed News, showed more than $2 trillion of such transactions took place between 1999 and 2017. Some international lenders appeared most often in the reports, including HSBC, Standard Chartered, JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank.
We are taking the fight against money laundering and against flight of capital very, very seriously. We are closely cooperating with criminal investigation authorities, just like other banks. What's being reported now is not new, not to us and not to our supervisory authority.
HSBC also said the files were historical and that it's embarked on a multi-year journey to overhaul its ability to combat financial crime. Standard Chartered said it takes its responsibility to fight financial crime extremely seriously and has invested substantially in its compliance programs. And American bank JP Morgan said it's devoted thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars to help fight financial crime.
These files cover a wide range of alleged criminal activity and are highly sensitive and confidential, which is why US officials say the unauthorized leak is a national security concern. But the reports do highlight the worries among US authorities about the UK's role in how dirty money is moved around. More than 3,000 British companies were named in the FinCEN files, more than any other country, with London's banking hub described as a weak link in the global financial system. Naweed Jabrakil, CGTN, London.
Well, let's head to Ghana now. The country is planning to list its gold royalty fund in London in October in a deal expected to be worth up to $500 million. Now, the government-backed Agiapa Royalties has hired Bank of America and JP Morgan to pursue an initial public offering at the London Stock Exchange. Africa's largest gold producer wants to take advantage of the good prices this year in order to raise that money if the plan does not run into political opposition. Now, Agiapa holds interests, including mining royalties in Ghana's gold assets. Royalties give a country the right to receive a percentage of production from mining operations or retain a stake in a mining firm. Well, let's move on now to South Africa. The country's former president, Jacob Zuma, has failed to appear before a corruption inquiry as his team prepares for his criminal trial in a decade-delayed arms deal case. He was meant to appear before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture. Here's Angelo Coppola taking up that story.
The former president has been to the commission once before and avoided a second visit due to health reasons.
It is entirely predictable that the former president didn't pitch up for testimony because he has been trying to avoid giving his version of events. And because he was not summoned, he wasn't legally obliged to come to the commission. And so he can't be punished, imprisoned, given a criminal record for refusing to come.
Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo told the former president's lawyers that on 9 October there would be a hearing about issuing a summons to force Zuma to appear.
He and his lawyers have been informed that unless I'm satisfied on that date that there are good grounds for them not to appear, if they do not appear, that application will proceed without them. They have been informed that should they wish to make use of a virtual appearance before the commission, and if they inform the commission timelessly, arrangements will be made for them to appear virtually.
Analysts aren't surprised by the approach taken by the former president.
If he is summoned, I would be surprised if he doesn't challenge the legality of that summons, and that will take the whole process beyond the end of the commission. He doesn't want to testify, and he has options to stop it.
Zondo is taking a firm line and wants the former president to testify before the commission between 16 and 20 November.
Those are the dates that I have determined. I know that in their letter, his attorneys said dates should be negotiated with him or with them. No dates will be negotiated with them or with him. This commission has made it clear to the attorneys who represented him before that this commission does not negotiate dates with witnesses.
Zondo needs Zuma to testify, and he went as far as offering to allow him to testify virtually, something he wasn't prepared to offer to any of the Gupta brothers who are also implicated in wrongdoing, corruption and state capture. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And in Nigeria, foreign trade continues to experience a downward spiral in the quarter ending in June. That is the country's third consecutive decline since 2019. Well, CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam now reports.
For nearly 6 months now, production at this honey factory in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, has stalled. Bee farmer Ademola Adeshino had spent over a decade producing and exporting honey and other byproducts to various parts of the world. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, he produced an average 150 tons of honey every year, mainly for exports. But now more than 80% of his earnings have been cut off.
We rear bees in the farm, and the lockdown has kept us indoors. We could not go to the farm. We have virtually not been able to do any export business throughout this year because of the lockdown.
Funds were lost. So if you begin to quantify it, in percentage-wise, I should say, so many people lost over 80-90% of what they would have gained this month. And then there were no serious stimulus packages from government to assist when these things happened.
Nigeria has continued to experience a major shortfall in trade. The country's Bureau of Statistics puts the latest plunge at 27%. Foreign trade dropped to $16.09 billion from $22.3 billion recorded in the second quarter of 2019. Exports too plummeted by 51.7% year-on-year to $6.1 billion, while imports declined by 14.6% to hit $11.1 billion year-on-year.
We know that industry in Nigeria is at the end of being totally out of existence, and yet the government is not looking at how to revamp the industrial sector. We have the manufacturing sector that is gradually going into moribund. There is need to establish or to ensure that we have functional infrastructure to accommodate our industrial processes and growth. If we really want to compete globally and earn enough foreign exchange, promote exports, then we need to put in place infrastructure.
Trade deficit is feared to impact on the country's revenue, being largely an oil-dependent nation. The report also reveals that Nigeria's imports still outweighs its exports. This is despite the government's land border closure in 2019 to discourage importation. Experts warn that a continuous trend could result in depleting of the forex earnings, leading to a decline in its GDP, currency devaluation, high debt service, and low per capita income. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, that is all for now on Africa Live Biz, but coming up later on Global Business Africa, Nigeria's central bank reduced its benchmark lending rate to 11.5% from 12.5%. We'll get you the details and, of course, the projected impact on its economy. All that coming up top of the hour. For now, back to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Ruche. You are watching Africa Live. Still more ahead after this break. Coming up, a jazz band encourages South Sudan to embrace a life of peaceful coexistence.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Across the world, people have been marking International Day of Peace. In South Sudan, though, peace is yet to be fully achieved years after a civil war ended. The UN peacekeeping mission in the country has been working with various partners to help build unity among communities, and one such partner is a jazz band from the town of Malakal, which hosts a UN site for internally displaced persons. The band calls on South Sudanese people to embrace a life of peaceful coexistence.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
For us as a jazz band, music is everything. So we decided to train youngsters in the UN protection site in Malakal for them to get to know their own cultures. There is a real challenge for displaced children across South Sudan to keep in touch with and have knowledge of their own cultures. So we wanted to find a way to keep our traditions alive among the younger generation. We would like these young children who have known nothing but conflict since birth to be able to take pride in their culture and grow up with feeling of being culturally South Sudanese. As a jazz band, we have played in many places across Malakal and collaborate with other artists as well as with UN humanitarian partners to engage in building peace among local communities. Our aim is to widen public participation in cultural activities, encourage social interaction and peaceful coexistence among all communities in Malakal, not just displaced people.
Coming up in your sports news up next. Uganda's Joshua Cheptegei eyeing the 10,000 meters after setting the 5,000 meter world record.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find